Good morning, all lovers of Maurice Merleau-Ponty. We will today at 1413 continue with a lovely little booklet by Merleau-Ponty, The World of Perception. And we are presently at page 86. And good news when it comes to the audio, we now have new microphones. I just need to learn how they work. They seem to be very modern. So we ended at the first paragraph, so we'll begin with the second one. Some extra light here. Anyway. Slowly. Slowly. It's good to learn patience, I think. So, second paragraph, page 86. When they address this issue, today's psychologists emphasize the fact that we do not start out in life immersed in our own self-consciousness, or even in that of things. But rather from the experience of other people. I never become aware of my own existence until I have already made contact with others. Indeed, very interesting. My reflection always brings me back to myself. Yet, for all that it owes much to my contacts with other people, an infant of a few months is already very good at differentiating between goodwill, anger, and fear on the face of another person. At a stage when he could not have learned the physical signs of these emotions by examining his own body. This is because the body of the other and its various movements appear to the infant to have been invested from the outset with an emotional significance. This is because the infant learns to know mind as visible behavior just as much as in familiarity with its own mind. The adult himself will discover in his own life what his culture, education, books and tradition have taught him to find there. The contact I make with myself is always mediated by a particular culture, or at least by a language that we have received from without and which guides us in our self-knowledge. So while ultimately the notion of a pure self, the mind, devoid of instruments and history, may well be useful as a critical ideal to set in opposition to the notion of a mere influx of ideas from the surrounding environment. Such a self only develops into a free agent by way of the instrument of language and by taking part in the life of the world. Excuse me just a second here. This is because the body of the other and its variant movements appear to the infant to have been invested from the outset with an emotional significance. This is because the infant learns to know mind as visible behavior, just as much as in familiarity with its own mind. An incredibly interesting observation by Merleau-Ponty. The adult himself will discover in his own life what his culture, education, books and tradition have taught him to find there. The contact I make with myself is always mediated by a particular culture, or at least by a language that we have received from without and which guides us in our self-knowledge. So while ultimately the notion of a pure self, the mind devoid of instruments and history, may well be useful as a critical ideal to set in opposition to the notion of a mere influx of ideas from the surrounding environment. Such a self only develops into a free agent by way of the instrument of language and by taking part in the life of the world. this leaves us with a very different view of the human being and humanity from the one with which we began. Humanity is not an aggregate of individuals, a community of thinkers. Each of whom is guaranteed from the outset to be able to reach agreement with the others because all participate in the same thinking process. Thinking essence, sorry. Nor, of course, is it a single being in which the multiplicity of individuals are dissolved and into which these individuals are destined to be reabsorbed. As a matter of principle, humanity is precarious. Each person can only believe what he recognizes to be true internally, and at the same time, nobody thinks or makes up his mind without already being caught up in certain relationships with others. Which leads him to opt for a particular set of opinions. Everyone is alone, yet nobody can do without other people. Not just because they are useful, but also when it comes to happiness. has no way of living with others, which takes away the burden of being myself, which allows me to not have an opinion. There is no inner life that is not a first attempt to relate to another person. In this ambiguous position, which has been forced on us because we have a body and a history, we can never know complete rest. We are continually obliged to work on our differences, to explain things we have said that have not been properly understood. To reveal what is hidden within us and to perceive other people. Reason does not lie behind us. Nor is that where the meeting of minds takes place. Rather, both stand before us, waiting to be inherited. Yet we are no more able to reach them definitely than we are to give up on them. It is understandable that our species charged as it is with a task that will never and can never be completed. And at which it has not necessarily been called to succeed, even in relative terms. Should find this situation both cause for anxiety and a spur to courage. In fact, these are one and the same thing. For anxiety is vigilance. It is the will to judge, to know what one is doing and what there is on offer. If there is no such thing as benign fate, then neither is there such a thing as its malign opposite. Courage consists in being reliant on oneself and others to the extent that, irrespective of differences in physical and social circumstance, all manifest in their behavior and their relationships that very same spark which makes us recognize them. Which makes us crave their assent on or their criticism. The spark which means we share a common fate. It is simply that this modern form of humanism has lost the dogmatic tone of earlier centuries. We should no longer pride ourselves in being a community of pure spirits. Let us look instead at the real relationships between people in our societies. For the most part, these are master-slave relationships. We should not find excuses for ourselves in our good intentions. Let us see what becomes of these once they have escaped from inside us. There is something healthy about this unfamiliar gaze we are suggesting should be brought to bear on our species. Voltaire once imagined in Micromegas that a giant from another planet was confronted with our customs. These could only seem derisory to an intelligence higher than our own. Our era is destined to judge itself not from on high, which is mean and bitter, but in a certain sense from below. Kafka imagines a man who has metamorphosed into a strange insect. And who looks at his family through the eyes of such an insect. Kafka also imagines a dog that investigates the human world which it rubs up against. He describes societies trapped in the corpus of customs which they themselves have adopted. In our day, Maurice Blanchot describes a city held fast in the grip of its laws. Everyone is so compliant that all lose the sense of their difference and that of others. To look at human beings from the outside is what makes the mind self-critical and keeps it sane. But the aim should not be to suggest that all is absurd, as Voltaire did. It is much more a question of implying, as Kafka does, that human life is always under threat. And of using humor to prepare the ground for those rare and precious moments at which human beings come to recognize, to find one another. Very beautifully put by Maurice. I do like his writing style. And something that especially stuck to my mind is that the growing infant doesn't start with itself until later in the development. There seemed to be an understanding before, and how it is able to react to joy, anger, sadness, without even knowing itself. that does remind me about the Klein bottle. A discovery or invention of the German mathematician, topologist Felix Klein. It is a device that shows how the subject already interpenetrates what is outside of it. And at the very same time also is able to look inside. I think here we are once more standing in front of a very interesting difference. In the previous lecture, we spoke about the body and the mind. As being absolutely different in every aspect. But also miraculously, absolutely identical. The difference here, this part of the chapter, is between inside and outside. It is not the same dichotomy, but it shares similarities. And I think most usually we end up making a choice. Either all is coming from the outside, or everything stems from the inside. And as I said in 1412, I think they are, just as in the Klein bottle, absolutely separated and separable. They are also the very same in all aspects. So although we look outwards, it doesn't mean that we lose our inward. They go hand in hand, and they can remain different. Just like in the Klein bottle. And I would say even so, them being different is what makes it possible for them to be same. A peculiarity, but as we know, this is also reality. Lying in the very foundation of what is real is the contradiction. Night and day are the same, as indicated by the famous Greek philosopher Heraclitus. It is even more true here. And I think our trial at resolving the contradictions lead us astray. It leads us to create an outer world that is more real than our inner world. And a sort of hierarchy is developed. Which in the end leads to reductionism. I am the particles outside of me. I'm stemming from the outside. And as Merleau-Ponty, absurdity will then come to the fore. Where I reduce myself to what I claim subjectively is the outside. Something of a slogan in analytical philosophy until recently. Thereby giving an air of rationality and clarity.
Repeat the slogan, please.
Go to the things themselves. They are clear. They are communal. We share them. There are many good arguments in the Vienna Circle, for instance. And they had me tricked for decades. The Klein bottle is a slow way of softening those hardened borders which forces us to make a choice where no choice should be made. The Klein bottle and quantum mechanics clearly shows that inside and outside is perpetually interpenetratable. And this is a foundational trait of space, not a derived, not a secondary. It is in there. Rather long comment. Maybe Kalle hasn't been too tired to have a comment here.
Thank you. Please, can you perhaps lift the... Let me repeat one page. You began with page 86, and there is one phrase, or two phrases, that is, I think, important. Today's psychologists emphasize the fact that we do not start out in life immersed in our own self-consciousness, or even in that of things, but rather from the experience of other people. I never become aware of my own existence until I have already made contact with others, and so forth. And this made me think about Carol Rovelli's relational quantum physics. He says that electrons don't always exist. Electrons only exist when they interact. After Rovelli invented relational quantum physics, he discovered the Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna. How do you pronounce it? Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna. Buddhist philosopher who died 250 Common Era. Nagarjuna had the same thoughts, roughly, that we exist only in interaction with others. So I think here it's great that three philosophers more or less have, or philosophers, Rovelli is not a philosopher, but quantum physicist. He's also a philosopher, we could say. We have three people here who great thinkers who have more or less the same idea. And that is Nagarjuna, Rovelli, and Merleau-Ponty. That is, we exist only in interaction with others. I think that is the great takeaway from this lecture. Now back to you, Hans, if you want to add something.
Yes, very good, Kalle, thanks. It might be time to take up Nagarjuna. Yes, relation with others. There are, maybe one could say that the misunderstanding of relation, this is a guess I have here now. Let it sink in and return to it at the end of the lecture. Could be that the misunderstanding of what a relationship is, so to speak, between matter and mind, inside and outside, oneself and others, the atoms of the universe, or photons if you like, turning that into a more relation of a contradictory nature or excluding nature, and thereby saying this one is more real, to be prioritized, and the other one marginalized or shut away, ignored. It's just a thought for food, something to figure, and it could actually be that thing that Ravel is indicating, a sort of not being too skilled with relations, seeing them as necessary, excluding each other. And since I had that tendency myself, I does for me ring true. But let's examine it. I will, after the pause, read a little bit more and we can discuss it, because something came up here in my thinking that could be well worth taking up. Could you put a pause, Kalle? So we continue with the second leg of the lecture. And now we gone into lecture 6, Art and the World of Perception. The preceding lectures have tried to bring the world of perception back to life. This world hidden from us beneath all the sediment of knowledge and social living. In so doing, we have often had recourse to painting, because painting thrusts us once again into the presence of the world of lived experience. In the work of Cézanne, Juan Gris, Braque, and Picasso, in different ways we encounter objects. Lemons, mandolins, bunches of grapes, pouches of tobacco. That do not pass quickly before our eyes in the guise of objects we know well. But on the contrary, hold our gaze, ask questions of it, convey it to it in a bizarre fashion, the very secret of their substance, the very mode of their material existence. And which, so to speak, stand bleeding before us. This is how painting this is how painting led us back to a vision of things themselves. Reciprocally, a philosophy of perception which aspires to learn to see the world once more as if in an exchange of services rendered, will restore painting and the arts in general to their rightful place. Will allow them to recover their dignity and will incline us to accept them in their purity. What then have we learned from our examination of the world of perception? We have discovered that it is impossible in this world to separate things from their way of appearing. Of course, when I give a dictionary definition of a table, a horizontal flat surface supported by 3 or 4 legs, which can be used for eating off, reading a book on, and so forth. I may feel that I have got, as it were, to the essence of the table. I withdraw my interest from all the accidental properties which may accompany that essence. Such as the shape of the feet, the style of the molding, and so on. In this example, however, I am not perceiving, but rather defining. That defining here, my comment is very close to vorhanden, not really be with the table. By contrast, when I perceive a table, I do not withdraw my interest from the particular way it has of performing its function as a table. How is the top supported? For this is different with every table. What interests me is the unique movement from the feet to the tabletop with which it resists gravity. This is what makes each table different from the next. No detail is insignificant. The grain, the shape of the feet, the color and age of the wood, as well as the scratches or graffiti which show that age. The meaning table will only interest me insofar as it arises out of all the details which embody its present mode of being. If I accept the tutelage of perception, I find I am ready to understand the work of art. For it too is a totality of flesh in which meaning is not free. So to speak, but bound. A prisoner of all the signs or details which reveal it to me. Thus the work of art resembles the object of perception. Its nature is to be seen or heard, and no attempt to define or analyze it. However valuable that may be afterwards as a way of taking stock of this experience. Can ever stand in place of the direct perceptual experience. This is not immediately all that obvious. In most cases, a painting, so it is said, represents objects. A portrait often represents someone whose name we are given by the painter. Is painting not, after all, comparable to the arrows in stations, which serves no other purpose than to point us towards the exit of the platform? Indeed, does it not resemble those exact photographic reproductions which retain all the essential features of the object and allow us to examine that object in its absence? If this were the case, then the purpose of painting as such would be to serve as a trompe-l'œil, and its meaning would lie entirely beyond the canvas, in the objects it signifies, in its subject. Yet all painting of any worth has come into being in opposition to precisely this conception of its role, one which painters of the last 100 years at least have quite consciously resisted. According to Joaquin Gasquet, Cézanne said that the painter takes hold of a fragment of nature and makes it entirely painting. Braque put it even more clearly when, 30 years ago, he wrote that painting does not strive to reconstitute an anecdote, but rather to constitute a pictorial event. So painting does not imitate the world, but is a world of its own. This means that in our encounter with the painting, at no stage are we sent back to the natural object. Similarly, when we experience a portrait aesthetically, its resemblance to the model is of no importance. It would take us too long to investigate here why, under the circumstances, painters in general tend not to fabricate the kind of non-existent poetic objects that some have produced on occasion. Suffice it to say that even when painters are working with real objects, their aim is never to evoke the object itself, but to create on the canvas a spectacle which is sufficient unto itself. The distinction which is often made between the subject of the painting and the manner of the painter is untenable, because as far as aesthetic experience is concerned, the subject consists entirely in the manner in which the grape, pipe, or pouch of tobacco is constituted by the painter on the canvas. Does this mean that in art, form alone matters and not what is said? Not in the slightest. I mean that form and content, what is said and in the way which it is said, cannot exist separately from one another. Indeed, I am doing no more than taking note of an obvious truth. If I can get a sufficiently clear idea of an object or tool that I have never seen from a description of its function, at least in general terms, by contrast, no analysis, however good, can give me even the vaguest idea of a painting I have never seen in any form. So in the presence of a painting, it is not a question of my making ever more references to the subject, to the historical event which gave rise to the painting. Rather, as in the perception of things themselves, it is a matter of contemplating, of perceiving the painting by way of silent signals which come at me from its every part. Which emanate from the traces of paint set down on the canvas, until such time as all, in the absence of reason and discourse, come to form a tightly structured arrangement in which one has the distinct feeling that nothing is arbitrary, even if one is unable to give a rational explanation of this. And here I would say Merleau-Ponty goes into another difference, and he eloquently and carefully goes into this area which resembles a bog. It's very easy to get stuck.
Okay.
You can put a little pause. Some of the Impressionists used to take things directly from nature. For instance, going to the beach and getting a handful of sand, looking at it carefully, and sometimes even bringing it to the house. Cézanne had a very acute vision. It was enough for him to gaze sharply and then use the sand in the painting. The sand is what is depicted, but it is also the depictor. And we have now entered into one of the most, I would say, troublesome relations, as I call it. And that is between what is depicted and the depiction. And elegantly, Maurice Merleau-Ponty puts it also in the context of inner and outer. My engagement, which is oddly enough very close to this relation between depicted, we say this is the painting of sand and this is the actual sand. To make it even clearer, the color, the oil color, is made of sand. It's not made of something else. And it depicts sand. It's a troublesome thing that could turn into a sharper contradiction between, as in Saussure, sign and signified. See the sameness here. And usually it's a temporal order that also makes up a sharp contradistinction. We want to place this hierarchically higher. It starts with the sand. Whereas the painting is derivative, secondary. But here in this impressionist example, the question is, what depicts what? And is this very sand previous in a temporal sense? Is it truly before? And can really the painting take a second chair, being just a representation of the more real depicted original of the sand. Jacques Derrida often dwindled into this. It's a complex, but I would say very rewarding thing to look into. Painting is actually an excellent way of approaching this difficulty. By some people said that it was the invention of the early photo, the daguerreotype, that caused Impressionism to blossom as sort of a reaction to the daguerreotype and the late developed photo. I don't think Cézanne would have agreed with that. But plagued by the photo, or rather the idea of the photo, is that of what is being depicted in the photo is termed real, and the depiction is just a copy, something less. Compare that to the before mentioned inner and outer. Not very seldom the outer has a tendency to take the first chair as being hierarchically first, temporally, and existentially sort of more primary than the inner. I always thought that is this sharpened distinction. I would say it's very close to having more or less of two pointed edges. And if you can get down the pointiness, make it, if you like, more jagged, you can keep the difference, but you can also embrace sameness. And you will not lose anything. You will gain. It could be helpful here to think about the Norwegian coastline mentioned many times before. They do have, in even general measurement, the second largest coastline in the world, beaten only by one country that obviously has a much larger coastline, that of Canada. But it is, in the case of the coastline, very hard to say one is sea and the other is coast. The the coast is shaped by the sea. So historically, although it should be temporally after, it is also before. And we most usually see the sea as being inferior and the coastline hierarchically more important. There are no statistics about the sea lines from the ocean's perspective. It is less, it's fluid, but it becomes absolutely obvious in the case of the Norwegian coastline that they participate relationally. That does not diminish their individuality at all. Just the opposite. This jaggedness gives strength. It gives the ability to be stable and uphold individuality. And of course, this is also something happening in daily life this time. What is the source, we ask? And we make things less, I would say, natural, because this jaggedness is nature itself. It is what makes things strong. But we tend to make it as sharp as possible. A sharpness that makes it fragile, less knowledgeable. It's not very hard to see topologically, mathematically, and visually that this more sharpened way contains less. And although it seems better to be concise, clear, and distinct in an almost mechanical way, it is not absolutely true. I think it's a perception that could be challenged or looked into more deeply. As Jacques Derrida did in his whole career, seeing what he called dichotomies, eroding the text, diminishing it to sharpened, pointy edges, telling less, being less powerful and poetic and beautiful. Something of a similar point is made by Merleau-Ponty here. If we go into hard to the inner subjective experience of the painting, something of it gets lost. And that is an inflation, diminishing in the very experience. outcome of such a sharpened position, almost aggressive when it is at its peak, its distances between what the painting depicts and what is depicted. And we get less of understanding and experience. Oh, that was a rather interesting subject. Let's have a comment from Kalle here.
This is not good. Can you check that the viewer sees this text? As the viewers perhaps remember, we went through Terry Marstallo in the month of December 2022, that is last year. And she published a paper that we went through, fractal entanglement between observed and observer. So please check out that lecture from December 2022. And she wrote one very important sentence. It's so
Kalle, could you please write out her first name?
Ah, yes, of course.
It would be easier for...
Yes, Terry. It's a lady, of course. Terry.
Cheers.
Do you see the... Yes, Terry.
Yes.
So I will... So the name of her paper was Fractal Entanglement Between Observed and Observer. And the one phrase that was, I think, important, the key phrase, the rate by which more information becomes available as we shrink the size of our measuring device. So we are one and the same. That is, so the observer decides the reality, so to say, in this case, because we are entangled both with the measuring device, but also with the thing that is observed. That is the rate by which more information becomes available as we shrink the size of our measuring device. And that is what you tried to show here to us. And you earlier mentioned a phrase that was your paraphrase, Hans. You said that we should embrace sameness. But I would like to contest this idea. I think provocation is good. So you said embrace sameness. I ask if we should not rather embrace similarity. And I even ask if sameness exists. Let me take an example, my field, New Testament manuscripts. There is not one manuscript that is the same to another. There is always some difference. That is, they are similar, but they are not the same. So I think that is where all New Testament scholars, for instance, they have fallen into this trap, thinking that the measuring device should be sameness, while the measuring device is to say similarity, because sameness is a sickness. There is no sameness. There is no sameness. It can never be any sameness in nature. No, neither in manuscripts or in real life. There is no sameness. It happens to be same. Rather, what we have is similarity. So we should embrace similarity. Would you agree, Hans, or did I provoke too much?
No, not at all, Kalle. Thank you for the provocation. Did like it. Yes, yes. It's actually a lecture I'm going to have, lying in this very briefcase at this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And it has to do with quantum mechanics and what they call identical. And I think that is also similar to what you're referring to, identical as same. And it's also a very important subject to address. The idea of identity is residing here somewhere. When we make, for instance, the original more real, and taken that further and further, it will end up with sameness or identity. Or same, as you said. I do agree. Sameness or likeness. Nothing in the universe is identical. And that's a complete misunderstanding of the world. In a degree-wise fashion, you can be different parts of the scale. But it's a bit like, I don't understand that this is my take on this chapter of Maurice. You need to realize you are the measuring device, your experience, your inner. By doing so, you will not diminish the other side. It will become more strong, deeper. Reality doesn't disappear. It becomes more complex. More diverse, having more information. When I acknowledge my inner experience, the inner take, the outer becomes more present. I don't know if it's time for a short example here. Is there any time left on the
1 hour 49, so you have perhaps 10 minutes if you are lucky.
See here, I'll give an example here. Merleau-Ponty is so close to going into experience, and if to use the Heideggerian phrase, presencing. When you find a moment of stillness, you will notice reality becomes stronger. One could say that you are making your measuring device smaller or more complex, and all of a sudden, right here now, when I speak to you, I feel a stronger presence. And for the first time, I hear the toilet flushing behind me. I see the sunlight on top of the roof. I am now enlarging my inner and the outer. Susie Froebel called it the depth of time. Instead of the more cumbersome phrase, cumbersome in the sense that Kalle mentioned here of same and identical. Cumbersome phrase time stops, because that reinforces the idea of a separate time, way outside of ourselves. She said time becomes more, deeper, more telling, and being able to give more knowledge, information. This is becoming more jagged, present. It is softening those two sharp points that demands the extermination of the subject in praise of the original. It also brings tension to one's experience, becomes less flowing, hardened. And you lose out on the painting. You reduce it to an opaque object. And in that very process, you simultaneously becomes less transparent. There is a word here from chemistry and biology to speak about this thing, and it's called osmosis. Be open to the environment, taking it in, and it doesn't hinder or destroy the individuality of the cell. On the contrary, it makes it less fragile, it strengthens it. So they are like the hands of Escher that we often come back to. They are cooperating in building up the drawing. And if you like, you can call one of Escher's hand the subject, the drawer, and the other one what is being drawn. But it is easy to see in his drawing that they are doing it together without diminishing any of them. Okay.
Thank you, goodbye.